speak to you all about the well building standard. Emmanuel, are you happy that I just share my screen and kick off with the presentation?
Please go ahead. You have the floor now.
Great, thank you. Okay, if you guys just bear with me, I'm going to open up the presentation. Can you let me know if you guys can see that okay?
Yes, we can see.
Fabulous. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so here we go. This is an introduction to the well building standard, and we're going to talk briefly about where did well come from, what's the well history, and we're going to talk a little bit of detail around some of our current programs. So we have something called the Well Health Safety Rating, Well Portfolio, Well Community. Also wanted to touch a little bit about well and ESG. And then a final slide is going to talk about the potential for any of you all who are interested in exploring well to apply for our well accredited professional. And then at the end, hopefully we're going to have some time to wrap up some questions. So if you can hold on to the end, I know Emmanuel and Jackie are going to be manning the Q&A chat. So if you've got some interesting questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll have time at the end to discuss them. So let's get right into the details. So for those of you who are not familiar, the IWBI stands for the International Well Building Institute, and we are the guardians of the well building standard. And we have a really simple purpose. It's to create people first places, really trying to help the world be aware that buildings have an impact on our health. And we are really keen that buildings be sustainable, but we also realize that buildings should really be addressing the people inside the buildings and helping us understand how we can improve their health by the buildings that they occupy. I also wanted to put this slide up because I think this is it's a really interesting slide, and it's also a very interesting time in the world where, as Emmanuel said, we're coming out of, or possibly still in, depending on where you are in the world, the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think, and I truly believe that this has brought health into a really important perspective around the world. And health now means a lot of different topics. So it means health, safety, and emergency preparedness. How will we prepare ourselves for something to happen like this again? It's also talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why were some people affected more, and why is health not an equitable outcome? Climate change as a public health issue, the impact of mental health, and ESG alignment, which really talks about environmental, social, and governance. And the last area, which is, obviously really key for most of the companies that are trying to get their folks back to the office, is how do we provide spaces where employees are engaged and productive? So we're going to talk a bit about the history of the well building standard, and it really all started back in 2014. We launched the well building standard on the back end of 6 years of research, and it was really quite shocking to think people were asking questions of the medical profession that said, if folks are spending 90 to 97% of their life inside buildings, what's the medical impact of that decision? What happens to the body when it's under artificial light for 8 hours out of the day? What happens if we're sitting at our desk and not moving? What are the impacts of that on our mental, our physical, and physiological health? So it was really interesting to think that we haven't done that, or haven't done enough research asking those specific questions. So we then launched Well version 1 back in 2014. And then we really quickly started to realize that there were companies and areas very much talking about master planning that were keen to say, well, we get that you've got Well version 1 for buildings, but what if we're looking at a brand new neighborhood? So we launched something called Well Community. In 2019, we started to see clients that were looking to do more than one building in their portfolio, and they didn't want to have to resubmit documentation for every building. So we created a program called Well Portfolio, or Well at Scale. And then obviously the world came to a screeching halt in 2020. We really learned from our community that they wanted to understand better about the health and safety protocols for reopening buildings. So we launched a program called the Well Health Safety Rating. We also moved and graduated from Well version 1 to Well version 2. So we updated the Well program. And today, the version that everyone around the world is looking at is Well V2. And now in 2021 and 22, we're launching smaller programs called Well Health Equity Rating, Well Performance Rating, and we'll be looking very quickly at Well for individual homes. So we're doing a lot to launch in the next year or so. Also thought it would be important to really start to see what is the outcome when we look at the impact that the pandemic has had on the awareness of well. So you can see here, I've tried to overlay the launch date of those various products. And you can see very clearly that between 2019 and 2020, the well awareness has tripled. Right before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were about to reach 1 billion square feet. And very quickly, with the awareness and just the focus on human health, our rating system deployed to over 3 billion square feet in less than 18 months. So we can see now that health and safety and just the awareness of healthy buildings has absolutely transitioned from a really nice to have to something that's really critical for us to be considering as we move forward. So I wanted to kind of go back a bit to the very beginning, just so everybody on the line here today has a bit of an understanding of why well is different than any other building rating system. So I thought it would be important to just talk about the 10 concepts of well. And for the architects and the engineers that are in the audience, you'll look at these 10 concepts and think, I get it. You know, it's about water, it's about air quality, it's about light and thermal comfort. Those are really very common building blocks of designing a good building. But what you will realize is that we've now moved into some really human-centered concepts like mind, community, movement, nourishment, the impact of sound on your brain and mental health. And then the last concept is about materials. So I thought we'll go into each one in detail just to give you a quick idea of what are some of the things that well would be looking at. I won't go through every single bullet point on every slide, but I'm going to pick out a couple that highlight why these are different than a typical building design system. So air is at the top of our list. It's one of the most important and critical parts of a space. And we're looking at ventilation design. We're looking at air quality. So what's the levels of contamination in the air? And obviously this is the concept that's had the most follow-up coming out of the pandemic. And how can we measure air quality ongoing? When we think about water, this is very different than sustainability rating systems where we're trying to reduce the amount of water consumption. When we're talking about healthy water and access to healthy water, we're talking about doing some testing on water to make sure that they don't have things like pesticides and herbicides and lead. So we're looking at an extra level of testing across the water. And then the other area that we're doing is we're trying to encourage drinking. People do not drink enough water. And we know for a fact that I think that there's a crazy statistic that it's like 80% of the population really don't have enough water in their brains at any given time because we just don't drink enough. So this is about promoting drinking water inside office spaces. The third category is nourishment. And again, there isn't many building rating systems out there that are talking about food, but we know that food is absolutely critical. And we need to try and help people move away from obesity, diabetes, and chronic health issues. And we think that if we can educate folks when they're working or inside the buildings that we design, it's an opportunity to change behavior. The other area that we capture inside the nourishment concept is about creating mindful eating spaces. So trying to encourage people to move away from their desks and not eat at their computers, but finding places where people can be social and get to know each other. And that has a huge positive impact both on mental health and even on your food systems inside your body. Light has turned out to be one of the most critical areas after air. And that's because, again, going back to this crazy statistic that we spend up to 95% of our time inside buildings, what is the impact of artificial light on our bodily systems, including opening and closing of the day, and how can artificial light prevent our bodies from reaching that type of natural hormone stimulation? So this has become a really important concept that we're looking at in real detail. As I mentioned before, movement is really, sedentary behavior is considered the new smoking. It has such a massive impact on our overall health. So how can we design buildings that actually promote physical movement? And that can mean a sit and standing desk. It can mean providing some sort of movement classes within the building. We're not thinking that giving someone a gym membership or encouraging people to move when they're finished with work is the right solution. So how do we get people moving when they're in the office? Thermal comfort is actually a very typical rating system, but what's really critical here is understanding that we should be designing buildings that have different zones for temperature. There are variations of people that would prefer to work in a cooler environment, a warmer environment. So instead of thinking that there's one size that fits all, how can we design buildings where people can work where it's best for them? Sound is another, I would say that's the third most important criteria. And we've really learned that in the transition from designing from cellular offices to open plan working, there's been a huge impact on people's mental health being in loud environments. So this is more about really creating spaces inside buildings that have different sound experiences based on what task people need to be doing. This category of materials is really important, and this is where IWBI feels like we're putting a really good amount of pressure on the supply chain to start moving away from chemicals inside our products. And that chemical exposure comes from paints, furniture, finishes, fabrics. So by really putting a focus on materials and the impact that unhealthy materials can have on human health is where we feel like we're putting a huge amount of pressure, with the hopes that that pressure will start moving the supply chain to remove some of those chemicals. The last two categories is really where WELL starts to talk very, very much about human health, mental health, and also the HR. So human resources is a very strong component of WELL. It's not just a building rating system, it's about an opportunity to really change the way that human resources enters into the dialogue for health at the building level. So it's in this category or concept that we focus a lot on stress management, the connection to nature. The word that you'll start to hear quite a bit of is the word called biophilia, which is when we start using more natural materials inside buildings. And we know that that has a huge impact on mental health. And the last category, again, called community, is where we capture many of our human resources components. So what type of support is a company giving to new parents? What type of support do we give to anyone who's got a handicapped, or accessibility and universal design? And again, how are we preparing for another emergency? How do we make ourselves prepared for those outcomes? So those are the 10 major concepts of WELL. And as I mentioned before, I think that WELL is a very unique proposition to be able to tie together policy, which is where you would have your human resources, design, where your architecture and engineering is coming together, and then your operations program. How is the building going to be managed once we design the criteria to be WELL certified? So it's a very unique opportunity to bring three very unique parts of the business together. So why is WELL version 2 different than WELL version 1? And that is really down to one very critical thing, is that WELL version 2 is designed to work with all types of buildings. So you don't need to have a special version of WELL if you're dealing with an industrial building, if you're dealing with a retail store, a multifamily residential building, a hospital, or a commercial office. It's the same version across all of the different buildings, and the building scorecard will determine what's the right outcome. So it's a very, very smart sort of digital system that allows you to generate a different scorecard based on the building usage, but you don't have to come up with a whole new set of frameworks for that. One of the most important aspects of WELL, so that everyone knows what I think is the intellectual property, the real USP, the real differential between WELL and other frameworks, is that if you're looking to get WELL certified, your building has to pass three important areas. It's actually four, I'm sorry, four important verified performance areas on site. And those include air quality testing, water quality testing, lighting levels, and acoustic levels. So a building cannot reach its full certification unless it passes through those four tests. And those four tests have to happen once a building is occupied. So that's a really important aspect to understand. The other area that's really critical here, let me just go back one more, is the slide, the different types of certification levels that we have. So we will work across a point system, very similar to LEED, if anyone's familiar with the LEED Green Building Council. What we look at are different stages of certification. So if you get to 40 points, and this is always out of 100, 40 will get you a WELL Bronze, 50 is a WELL Silver, 60 is a WELL Gold, and anything above 80 will get you a WELL Platinum. Another area that we focused on very, very quickly at the beginning of launching WELL is that we work with the green building councils and the rating systems around the world. So we created something called a crosswalk. So if your project is already working towards LEED certification or BREEAM certification, you can achieve a dual certification. And there's probably about between 19 and 27% of the features or credits will overlap between a green building rating system and ours. So you don't have to recertify those specific features. You will get credit from those certifications and not have to complete all the documentation for the same exact features that sit in WELL. So it's a really great, unique way of really pushing an important standard for both sustainability for the planet and sustainability for human health. So we're going to dive now into the WELL Health Safety Rating. So again, this was the rating system that was launched at the back, sort of in the middle of 2020. So at the very early stages of the pandemic, our WELL community came to us and said, look, we know that our buildings are vacant right now, but we are really key and critical to get those buildings reopened once we start to come out of the pandemic. And we don't have the time to do an entire WELL certification because our buildings haven't even been opened. So what we did is we went through our entire WELL certification program and we pulled out 22 of the most critical WELL features that would address the healthy and safe reopening of a building. And we created something called the WELL Health Safety Rating. And every building that passes these 22 features, we're able to get a seal on the front of their building. And that seal would allow people to realize that these buildings have gone through the separate certification. So we'll go into a little detail here to show you exactly what we did here. And what was, again, quite unique is that because we were pulling features from WELL V2, you were able to deploy the WELL Health Safety Rating across any building typology. Sports and entertainment, we have some of the biggest, the Yankees Stadium in New York, stadiums throughout America. We have even the Royal Albert Hall here in London. We have restaurants, hotels, and communities that have deployed the health safety rating, again, with the hope and the promise to explain to people what were the 22 features that were applicable for this standard so that they could understand how the building was prepared and ready to be reopened post-COVID. As I just mentioned, we're super excited that the Royal Albert Hall was one of those buildings very recently, about 3 months ago, that have passed their certification. And again, it was important for them to welcome back visitors and staff into the Royal Albert Hall, a 150-year-old building, and be able to showcase that they have done things to make that building safer. So what is it about, and why was it so important? So again, I mentioned that instead of 100 features across the 10 concepts of WELL, we reduced that down to a selection of 22 features. And those 22 features sit in these sort of 5 little buckets. The first one is about cleaning and sanitization protocols. So what were you doing to make sure that things stayed clean? What were the cleaning products that you used? How did you make sure that people had less hand touch surfaces? The second category was more of an HR bucket. So what are you doing for people when they return to work? How are you helping them with mental health, COVID vaccines, whatever it was that allowed those folks to come back to work? How were you managing that process? The third area is how are you communicating to your staff the types of benefits and health benefits that you've created in this building? The fourth area I think was really critical is that what's the emergency preparedness plan if something like this should happen again? I think many companies were caught off guard in 2020 without really knowing how they could get their people to be working safely at home. So this would come with templates to showcase what is our business continuity plan? How can we prepare for an emergency in the future where everyone knows what the process is? And the last category deals specifically with how can we make sure that the air quality and the water quality in a building that might have been stagnant or closed for 4 to 6 months, how can we make sure that those systems are cleaned and operated and ready for people to come back? So this became a really amazing, quick turnaround opportunity for our clients to do what needed to be done to get those buildings opened, achieve a very small selection of features, and be able to get that certification quite quickly. This gives you an idea of the types of clients that started to really follow this program immediately. And you'll see here by the number of assets, the real benefit here was that if you produced the health safety rating, and because it was based on policy and protocols, you could ensure that every one of your assets deployed the same features. So we were able to move this very quickly from a single building certification to something that could be rolled out across all of their assets wherever they are in the world, and everyone was operating from the same protocol. So every building in their portfolio was able to achieve this outcome, to be able to put a health safety seal on the front of their door, and clients and visitors were able to understand what this building did to meet the health safety criteria. So now we're going to talk a little bit about WELL Portfolio. And if you remember when I showed you the little timeline of what we developed, WELL Portfolio was an opportunity for our clients who, again, started to do well on 1 or 2 of their buildings and realized that they needed to have a much more seamless way of developing WELL across their entire program. So it enabled the portfolio program, enabled our clients to implement at scale. So that's the really key opportunity here, is that there's got to be an easier way to deploy the WELL features in multiple buildings within the same client body than to have to do one by one. So it's a very, I'll show you the reason why it was so simple. These are some of the clients around the world that were our first. There were 40 clients that decided to be our first portfolio providers. And I just wanted to give you a quick indication of why this was such a benefit. So number one, like I said, you're able to deploy the WELL features at scale. So that means that you're actually producing one set of documentation similar to the health safety rating, and you're able to deploy that set of certification material across multiple buildings instead of doing them one by one. You were also able to work on an online platform. So that meant, and I'll show you a picture of the platform in a minute, just gives you an idea of where your buildings are around the world and which programs or which of the 10 concepts you're deploying at each of those buildings. And there's huge cost benefits from doing it this way. So here's a really important way of understanding that. Remember before we talked about the fact that building certification for WELL is about bringing together design standards, HR standards, and sort of facilities management. So here's your opportunity to look at those three buckets. So for example, on the design strategy, let's say for an example that you've decided that every furniture for one of your clients, let's say it's Citibank, is going to be a sit-stand desk. They're going to have the opportunity to deploy ergonomic furniture. And that's going to be a corporate standard for Citibank for every building that they work with. You would then complete the ergonomic furniture feature, do it once, and then that feature would end up getting rolled out across every building that Citibank owns, which means that they don't have to do that certification more than once. Same with operational policies. If they're going to have a healthy cleaning protocol where they're only going to use cleaning material that's non-toxic, again, they will be able to deploy that feature once, and every building in Citibank's assets portfolio would be able to achieve that as well. And in the third bucket, which really talks about, HR and community management, if you're going to have new parent support or some sort of maternity paternity policy, if you provide all of the details for that once, you do not have to keep doing it for every building within the Citibank portfolio. So it becomes a really strategic and easy way of managing a company's operational policies, wellness programs, and even architecture and design features, and allow them to sort of create these on a portfolio-wide basis. This is an indication of what portfolio clients get at the end of the year. They will have a portfolio report that deals with where those assets are around the world, how many of those assets have gotten certification. And part of the portfolio program is that a client does not have to get every building in the portfolio certified. If they want to, it's going to be much easier, but they can also be always moving towards progress, strategic progress over time, and be able to get awarded for that. So you'll see here that they have up here 194 projects. They're across 18 countries. This is the sort of global square footage. And then they'd be able to see how many people were impacted and what their overall outcome was. And this is just an example of what, again, a WELL portfolio report looks like. And it helps our clients understand not only their annual FM program, but what are the focus areas that they'd like to deal with? Do they want to focus on thermal comfort? Do they want to focus on sound? So in the same activity as certifying some of their properties, they can also be focusing on certain concepts. And we work with our clients to be able to find out what their priorities are and how we can help them make the best use of this program. I also thought it would be interesting for those of you who might be working at an urban planning level to just understand a bit about WELL Community. And as I mentioned before, it is the master planning or urban planning focus of WELL. It's called WELL Community. And again, you'll see the same 10 concepts, but now we're talking about the spaces between the buildings at a massive urban planning level. So you're not looking at single assets on their own. You're looking at what at a master plan level can we do to address these 10 concepts. So I thought I would just show you a quick picture of our first WELL community was in Shanghai. It was the old Shanghai Expo. And you can see here that, this is a massive location. It has multiple buildings in it. Not every one of those buildings would be WELL certified, but there would be focus areas of the air in this space. What is the water usage in this space? How are you providing healthy food? How are you getting people to move through this community and get more exercise? So it's the same 10 concepts, but the focus is at a master plan level. I also thought it'd be nice to see a couple of shots on. So you can see in our mind concept that we have something called restorative spaces. So what are we doing for the community where they can be in a place that's beautiful and provides that sort of restoration? And this was one of the areas in the Shanghai Expo that they were able to design. The second one is about movement. Again, how are you creating a pedestrian friendly environment and how are you getting people to move more often? And this was part of their submission for that program. The fifth category that I thought we should really take some time and talk through is the discussion of ESG. So ESG means environmental, social, and governance. And for everyone who's familiar with the sustainability history, over the last 17 years, environmental rating systems like BREEAM and LEED have finally convinced companies that it's a good thing for the environment to create or deploy certification systems because it provides a manageable and trackable and measurable outcome. And now if a company is looking to prepare their ESG reports for their investors or other folks, they use the ESG frameworks around the world to measure what they're doing and help them communicate that what they're doing is a benefit. So let's just walk through the theory behind that topic, ESG. So we've seen the importance of environmental, social, and governance happen, over the last 15 years, but very recently, right after the COVID pandemic, there's been quite a bit of focus on the social aspect. How can we provide measurement and benchmarking around how social a company is? And we're starting to see that clients are really looking at health as an opportunity to really define the S and ES and G. And we think that's the next area for real leadership within this area. And I'll tell you why we're seeing that. So the program that we're focusing on is that we feel that governments are pushing clients to really dictate or help people understand the social value that they're bringing. I know here in the UK, if a client is building a new building, they will need to show how does that building impact the social and local environment where that building is coming from. And usually what will happen is the developer or the client, the end user, will either hire local labor or they will try and educate local employees. So there's an area to define their social value. And we're now seeing that clients are also using this question about social value as a way to talk about the health of their employees and the health of their staff and their visitors. So we're seeing that there's something happening here where health is becoming an opportunity to define that social part of ESG. We'll go into a little bit more detail. One of the other areas that folks are using health as an opportunity to talk about what they're doing is in something called the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are quite broad topics with absolute huge goals like ending poverty and ending hunger. And what we've been seeing is that every corporation is trying to find a way to show their alignment with the SDGs. So what WELL did is we went through each of our WELL features and we started to align them with the SDGs. So how can some of the features that a company might be deploying for WELL certification start to talk through the SDGs? And we've been able to show that alignment. And again, when a portfolio client of ours is working with us across all their assets, we can deliver a report at the end of that year and show them how many SDGs their portfolio was able to address by working with us on this program. And for those of you who work with clients that submit GRESB, which is another ESG framework, we also get alignment with GRESB that talks about health and WELL. And this is a really interesting process that we've seen now. So all of our portfolio clients, and you'll see these here, Cushman and Wakefield, Uber, Goldman Sachs, JLL, they have all started to communicate to their stakeholders, their investors, what they are doing at a healthy building level in these documents. So without even waiting for folks to be able to tell them how they're managing their ESG, they are starting to report what's important for them. So we're really seeing that become a really interesting dialogue. So I also wanted to talk about the WELL AP process. The WELL AP is the accredited professional. So if anyone wants to be able to really support clients who are working towards a WELL outcome, we started a program called the WELL AP. And that is an exam that's based on WELL version 2. It's a pretty challenging exam. I think it's 2.5 hours. And you're required to study and prepare based on the WELL version 2 material. So we're going to share with you all after today's webinar a link to the WELL AP landing page so that you could just be familiar with what the program requires and the types of study materials that are available. We've just generated a whole load of free study guides based on this new exam on WELL version 2. So it'll be great if anyone is really interested in taking that next step to download a lot of the material and just see if it's something that piques your interest. What I've found, and obviously I'm coming from a sustainability background, so I was a lead AP, a lead accredited professional back in 2004. And the information that really brought out my passion in sustainable buildings was the material behind the lead AP exam. And really transitioning into the WELL AP was really an incredible opportunity to really study the medical impact of the buildings that we occupy. And I think for those of you who might see that this is, sparking some sort of an interest with you, I would definitely download this free material and just read it, because it's such a human, it's all based on the sort of human impact. And it's almost going to be such an interesting journey for you, because as interesting as sustainability is, it's still planetary health. But when you start reading something that talks about human health and how you feel, it becomes something that really resonates with you. And I'd be really interested in getting some feedback from anybody who does go through the online portal and starts to download this information, because it really is quite interesting material. Also wanted to say that we have an incredible resources page on our website for anyone who might be thinking of just dipping their toe in, learning about what this program is. I've been really impressed with the IWBI's team, who really pulls together this type of